All eyes are on the massive decisions the Sixers need to make this offseason for the future of the Sixers franchise regarding who that big ticket free agent will be and how to round out the rest of the roster. However, there has not been enough attention paid to the smaller decisions that must be made, and that matters when keeping in the young talent that is within the organization. Now, we know the story of the Sixers offseason, that they spent all this time creating this flexibility, bringing in one-year contracts to basically give them all these options. But they still have some decisions to make for players with some non-guarantees. And to dive into exactly what that is, when looking at the active roster, there's Joel Embiid under contract for $51.4 million. Paul Reed has a $7.7 million non-guaranteed deal. Jeff Dowtin a $2.196 million club option, and a Ricky Council $1.89 million non-guaranteed deal. So what that means is the Sixers have a decision to make on all three of those younger players there, that they can waive both Ricky Council and Paul Reed without having any cap implications, and decline the club option for Jeff Dowtin, which also would free up a little bit of money. But I'm here to say why that is a bad idea, and I do want to go spot by spot with them. Now, most notably, we will talk about Paul Reed here. This is the one I'm the most open to, and the guy that out of the three of them I think is probably least likely to be back next year. Now, how we got here with Paul Reed. We know the story, the out-the-mud origin. This guy that was drafted in the second round played his way into a real-deal role on this Sixers team and developed into a guy that looked like the archetype of ideal backup for Joel Embiid. Flashback to last offseason, and he had got an interesting offer from the Utah Jazz, which is why we're in this situation right now. So to flash back to the restricted free agent sheet that he signed with Utah that the Sixers ultimately matched, this is written from ESPN here that says, Reed signed the offer sheet on Saturday morning, and the Sixers waited until 90 minutes prior to the 11:59 Eastern deadline to inform Utah that they matched the sheet. Reed has veto power on any trade and can't be moved to Utah for a full year. One of the terms of the offer sheet provided a unique twist on Reed's contract. The first season of the contract is fully guaranteed, but the next two seasons, worth $15.7 million, become guaranteed if the Sixers advance to the Eastern Conference semifinals, sources said. Given where the two franchises stand, it was more likely that the Sixers would have to guarantee those 24-25 and 25-26 seasons than the Jazz. So what that all means there is the Jazz tried to pull a fast one on the Sixers, saying that we're really pushing you that if you sign Paul Reed, you really believe in him, that you're making these, guaranteed for the next two seasons, with the expectation and implications that the Sixers would make it past the first round, which they've done a good amount of times so far during the Joel Embiid era. But ultimately, we know how things went down, how the Sixers were unable to keep their traditional route of high seeding due to the injury of Joel Embiid during the year, and ultimately were bounced by the New York Knicks in the first round of the playoffs. So lo and behold, they have a decision to make whether or not Paul Reed should continue to be on this franchise. Now, it was not the ideal season for Paul Reed. And to dive into specifically what he brought to the table, 7.3 points per game, 6.0 rebounds, 1.3 assists, 1.0 block, 0.8 steals, shot 54% from the field, 36.8% from beyond the three-point line, 64.3% of his twos were assisted. He had a defensive box plus minus of 1.0 and a VORP of 0.9, both a little bit low there. That VORP specifically you would like to be higher, but still just 24 years old, about to turn 25, and a guy that has had his moments where he shined as the backup to Joel Embiid. It also was interesting. I think part of the frustrations with Paul Reed specifically is he did not take those next steps to developing his game where he could potentially play alongside Joel Embiid. Didn't feel like he was a guy who earned Nick Nurse's trust, and this is now the second coach that hasn't believed in Paul Reed or given him the opportunity that a lot of us are clamoring for, and I do think those are all telling there. Now, the other side of things, this is where the main driving force why I don't really expect Paul Reed to be back next year, is that is a valuable trade asset for this Sixers team. And the reason I say that is that $7.7 million cap hit being non-guaranteed. What I guarantee Daryl Morey is doing right now is working the phones, trying to add a draft pick for the sake of that cap relief. That a team that is looking to shed some money can bring in Paul Reed and waive him and essentially get that 7.7 off the books right there. So maybe they're taking back a small contract in return, bringing in a potential role player that the Sixers may see value in, maybe a draft pick attached to it, and then that team can waive Paul Reed for the sake of ducking the tax or getting under a certain number that is, whether it be an apron issue or just a funding from the team, whatever that may be the case, that type of flexibility is something that could be appealing to teams. So that's something to keep an eye on there. And I think the overall tune is a little bit too negative on Paul Reed, that I think he mostly was fine. He didn't take these strides that were hoped. He didn't overall succeed in the playoffs. I certainly think the right decision is to bring in another backup center, at least to challenge Paul Reed, but I wouldn't be in full panic mode if he is back next year. Now, the other two guys I also want to discuss here, those of course being Ricky Council IV and Jeff Dowtin. Now, Ricky Council is obviously where I want to start here. He was one of these stories of this season, and to dive into what he produced, I want to start with his G League stats here. Looking at these, the top here being during the regular season averages and the bottom being the Showcase Cup. I did want to highlight both. The Showcase Cup under total, so a bit of a different format here. But during the regular season in the G League, of course, averaged 23.1 points per game, 5.2 rebounds, 2.2 assists, shot 35% from beyond the three-point arc on 5.5 three-point attempts per game. Shot it even better during the Showcase Cup at a 39.4% rate and attempted over 6 per game during this setting. He's a guy that took the opportunity and ran with it. But the Sixers ultimately picked up Ricky Council IV and Terquavion Smith after last year's draft, the two going undrafted, two guys that I do not think deserve to go undrafted there, and both guys that I am interested in having back next year. And the reason that I'm so dead set on this is there are limited ways in which you can bring in young players. The Sixers have stumbled across a guy that could potentially grow to be something. And Ricky Council IV is not perfect. He's a guy who has his flaws and needs to continue to adjust, but he's shown the signs of willingness to do that, and you got to call a spade that every time he came in the game, he found a way to impact winning at a high level, and he deserves credit for that. Now, this Sixers team specifically, too often they pass up on the opportunities to bring in young talent. That we've seen them trade plenty of draft picks. We've seen them make situations where you're like trading out of the 23rd pick, trading Jaden Springer for a second-round pick for no reason. These are bad ways to run a franchise. And particularly when you're running around the NBA and comparing teams, look at teams like the Boston Celtics, who are obviously in the NBA Finals right now. Teams like the Oklahoma City Thunder. That you take a step back and look at the roster and say, how are they so deep? How are they so talented? How do they have all these guys? Well, they draft them and keep them is the simple answer. That there are things to be done when you have a player within your organization with those type of bird rights and rights to a player that it's a much easier task to keep them rather than bring them in. And the way to bring those players in originally, the only true path is through the draft. That there are players that will be drafted by a team and likely never moved because a team sees more value than that contract will be the case. The Sixers miss out on all these guys when they do not make use of their draft picks in themselves. And we know that the draft coming up at the end of the month, the Sixers holding that 16th pick, and I do pray that they do use it here. But I do want to more discuss the players that they do have, that being Ricky Council here. Now, Ricky is an interesting one. Now, Daryl Morey has made it clear every decision is basically around flexibility at this point. And what makes it so hard, the position that they are in, is all these complementary players, the guys to round out the roster and build a complete team, drastically change depending on who that third star is. If it's Jimmy Butler, if it's LeBron James, if it's Paul George, if it's Brandon Ingram, whoever that player is, that big fish that Daryl Morey clearly has his eyes on, the supporting cast looks drastically different for each of these guys. For example, if it is Paul George, that's a guy that shoots 7.9 three-point attempts per game, that it doesn't become as much of a necessity to bring in a gunner. If it's Jimmy Butler, who shoots 2.1 three-point attempts per game, you absolutely need to find another player that's willing to absolutely let it fly from deep because that's so necessary to the spacing around Joel Embiid. Regardless of that case, I want Ricky Council IV on this Sixers team. That you're not going to get the type of production for a player on a $1.8 million deal. And I'll also note with Terquavion Smith, not officially under contract just now, but he did spend the entirety of last season on a two-way contract. The Sixers just upgraded Ricky Council IV very late in the regular season, which I thought was to provide the opportunity for him to be available in the playoffs. That did not come into fruition. Nick Nurse not showing that trust there. But for Terquavion Smith, he'll be a restricted free agent, meaning the Sixers have a chance to match whatever offer is thrown his way in a similar situation to what Paul Reed was in last offseason. Different path to getting there, but the same structure for his free agency setup. So I do hope that the Sixers do overall match that. That I think both Terquavion Smith and Ricky Council IV were slam dunk additions that were brought in through the two-way market after both going undrafted, and they're guys that I do think it's worth sticking with and seeing what they develop into. So the decision to be made here is the Sixers need to prioritize young talent. I don't need to hear all this flexibility, this case to maximize how much cap space that you have. When you have young players that are showing promise, don't oversimplify it. Try and keep them. That is mainly speaking in the Ricky Council IV front here, not as much in the Paul Reed. I can kind of go both ways with this. I do think that that is more fair market value and something that he can live up to more than people give it credit, but I certainly would not have an issue if the Sixers choose to go another direction. I also think it's fair to assess that maybe the best route for a backup center for Joel Embiid has more to do on the offensive end than the defensive end. In the past, I thought that way, but we saw how much that the offense straight up fell off a cliff every time Joel Embiid sat on the bench, and Paul Reed was not a guy capable of picking up that slack there. So we will dive deeper into that conversation once we know the decision here and who the roster moves could be moving forward. But appreciate you guys for tuning into this video. Make sure you're dropping a like on it. Any comments that you have below, anything else that you want me to get into, any video ideas, I would love to hear in the comments. Make sure you're smashing that subscribe button to catch up with everything we got dropping. Going to keep content flowing on the regular, getting closer to the big stories of the NBA offseason and the draft coming soon. So make sure you're staying locked for everything, and talk to you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.